How many we got? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. A waving vice president.
I was quietly listening as usual.
I know. That was very kind of you. It was most appreciated. So we're 8, and we're still waiting for, I think, Will. There's Will. We have a council member with no name, just council member, sort of a generic council member.
Who's that?
I don't know. Well, let's figure this out. We can probably figure it out. There's 9 of us here, but we can't. The unnamed council member is Council Member Rice. All right.
He had a name though.
Yeah, he did. Now he does. Yeah. Before he was just the council member.
Greg will not be silenced.
Yeah, there you go. Michelle, whenever you tell me to start, we're going to start. And Joy is telling us they can hear us, which is okay. They're ready. Okay. Thank you all very much. We are back from recess. We apologize for any of the inconveniences and everything associated with that. What we're going to have to do is start this topic over again. We're going to go back in the same order that we did before. Councilmember Navarro will lead it off. Then we're going to hear from Gene Smith. Then we're going to go back to Councilmember Navarro. Then we're going to hear from Councilmember Reamer, which is where we left off. Councilmember Friedson and Councilmembers Glass are on the list, and you will be on the list just as you were before. And Councilmember Navarro did make a motion, and Councilmember Friedson seconded it. So we're going to have that as well when it comes up. So with that, Councilmember Navarro, would you like to have a repeat of what you did, please?
Yes, sir. So this is item number 6. So last Thursday, the council unanimously supported setting the real property tax revenues at the charter limit, and the majority of the council supported the income tax offset credit at $692. In previous years, these actions were sufficient for finance staff to calculate the tax rates for the coming fiscal year. It has come to the council's attention, however, that the executive's recommended budget sets the real property tax revenues using a different method than prior years. This means that there are 2 possible rates that finance could generate, not one like previous years. Council staff has prepared a report discussing the alternative interpretation that the executive used when calculating the charter limit. Included in the staff report are tables detailing the differences in revenues and tax rates based on a 30-year history for calculating the charter limit and the executive's proposed interpretation. Council staff will provide additional details about this report momentarily, but I wanted to highlight that the charter gives the council ultimate authority to set the levies on revenues. Therefore, the council must take an additional step today to clarify the total amount of real property tax revenues that it will levy at the charter limit today. I will now turn it over to Mr. Smith to briefly highlight items from his report.
Thank you, Ms. Navarro. So as I shared previously, we're gonna get into the weeds of the charter limit today. As you noted, the council ultimately needs to set the revenues as it does every year, and so that's going to be the conversation on the real property tax revenues. The charter stipulates how the real property tax revenues are calculated each year in terms of the estimated revenues received from property taxes, as well as the percentage growth in the consumer price index. That calculation gives you what we call the charter limit, because that's the threshold limit before the council needs 9 affirmative votes, or all council members sitting affirmative votes to raise the levies above that. There are a few items that are excluded in the charter that are not needed to be included in the charter limit each year, and that's the conversation point for us today. Previously, the Department of Finance has included only the actual property tax revenues from new construction included in that, and Mr. Elrich is proposing, has only included actual property tax revenues. On page 2, you can see the calculations of what happens. Each year, the State Department of Assessments will do quarterly bills for new construction. And as I shared earlier, it's about a 60-40 split. The county will only collect about 60% of the total property tax revenues that could have been collected on new construction because of these quarterly bills, the 3/4, half, and 1/4. The other 40% is not collected because the properties were not online for the full year. What Mr. Elrich is proposing is to include that 40% back into the base calculation for the charter limit. And for this year, what that means is about $5.2 million extra in the total revenues the county can levy. And again, as council staff notes on page 3 for the tables, that includes about a 1/4 penny increase per $100 of assessed base in the property tax rates for fiscal 21 compared to what they would have been under the 30-year history. Council staff prepared not an exhaustive list, but some questions in terms of how this new method compares to the old method. The first question is, does this new method impact newly constructed properties? The answer is no, it does not impact newly constructed properties. Those will continue to get quarterly bills as they always have, and will pay taxes for that, whatever part of the year that they were online, and they will be folded into the tax rolls for next year. How does the executive's interpretation impact existing property owners? As noted, all existing property owners will be paying about a 1/4 penny increase this year. And then as long as this method is continued to use, we'll be paying a slightly higher tax rate each year to make up whatever that 40% difference is each year for the revenues that were not collected from newly constructed properties. Council staff does take a few minutes to talk briefly of are the terms in the charter revenues immutable? The actual variables used, estimated real property taxes and percentage growth in the consumer price index are clearly stated in the charter. There may be some ambiguity in terms of whether revenues, newly constructed property means just revenues collected or means all the revenues that could have been collected, as Mr. Elrich is proposing. And council staff notes that given how residents excluded these properties from the charter, there may be some reasonable sense to argue that including the total revenues makes sense. However, for the last 30 years, finance has been applying it based on actual revenues, and that is also an equally valid interpretation from the charter. So finally, the council question was whether will the council be exceeding the charter limit this year if they approve the county executive's proposed interpretation? And that answer is based on whether the council believes the county executive's interpretation is a valid use of a valid interpretation of the charter. If you decide to interpret that it is, then you would not be exceeding the charter limit. If you choose to not, sorry, I was getting interrupted. If you choose to set it based on the 30-year-old method, but want to retain the revenues that Mr. Elrich had proposed, you would need to, we recommend, Mr. Drummer, I recommend that you would vote that you would be exceeding the charter limit in order to do that. So that is the question before the council today, is do you agree with Mr. Elrich's interpretation of the charter to set the real property levies, or do you wish to set the real property levies based on the 30-year history? Thank you, Ms. Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. So before I turn it over to you, Mr. President, I would like to move that the council set real property tax revenues at the charter limit using the same methodology the county has used for the last 30 years. As the council has reiterated time and time again during this budget process, our residents and businesses deserve continuity in our budget. This is particularly important when it comes to proposed changes to such an important item as the county's tax revenues. Alterations to the charter limit methodology require detailed review and thorough public discourse, possibly even a charter amendment. Before the council adopts a change like this, I think that we should take our time to deliberate. Thank you, and that is a motion.
Thank you, and I have a motion, and it was seconded by Councilmember Friedson, just like Groundhog Day. Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Councilmember Reamer.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to the chair for her motion and her explanation of the issue. This is a very, there's a lot here. I guess I want to start by saying this is not about the details of mathematical formulas. It's not really about the amount of money that we're talking about here. This is about our values and our approach to government. And that's where my concern comes from. I do not share the view that in a different world we would calculate the property tax base in this manner. Perhaps we would, but the charter clearly prescribes how the property tax base will be calculated, and it does not allow for us to do it as the executive branch is recommending. The reason why I am so concerned about this proposal is because I really think it flies in the face of our approach to good government and to transparency. And that is really my concern in this moment. The charter says that we are allowed to calculate the tax base based on revenues that we've already collected. We cannot do it based on an estimate of revenues that we would collect in a year. It's what we have collected. And the problem with this proposal is it seeks to take a full year's value of the construction of new property when on average we only get 60% of that value. By substituting a hypothetical amount for the actual amount, that no longer provides a sound basis for the calculation of our property tax base. The problem with that is if we were to move forward on this basis, we would be very open to legal challenge. And if that challenge did not come in the first year, it might come in the second year or the third year or the fourth year or the fifth year. It's $5 million this year. It could be another $5, could be more next year, it could be less, could be more any given year, but it would keep adding up. And at some point, someone would challenge us. And to me, the plain reading of the charter does not allow for the proposed method. So there is a tremendous amount of risk in this proposal. And it's a risk that, we've already been through having to repay Wynn as a result of the Wynn case, millions and millions of dollars in income tax rebates. So why we would want to proceed with a new strategy similar to that using our property tax base is beyond me. The fundamental issue here is, given how risky it is, the fact that the county council and, even more importantly, the public was not informed of this proposal is highly problematic. If you look at the county executive's budget, you will not find an explanation of this decision. It's not there. The county executive did not present a budget explaining this method of calculation. The fact is, it is a $5 million increase in property taxes from all payers of property taxes in the county. But there's no explanation of that in the county's budget. It is unthinkable to me that we would have a tax increase that has not actually been transparently presented to the community, and what more, is actually illegal. It is a violation of the charter. The combination of those two aspects of this proposal are just profoundly troubling. And so I support the motion. I do think we have to reject it. It's not about the money. This is not an anti-tax thing. This is about good government and transparent decision-making. And I really think it was a profound mistake to include this in the budget. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to build upon that. I'll try to be as brief as I can. I share in the deep concerns about this proposal, not just for the thought process and the public debate that could have happened and should have happened but didn't happen, but in the process of putting this forward in the manner in which it did. Public policy means public input, and we cannot have transparent and accountable policy making unless there are transparent and accountable decisions for how we make those decisions, how we calculate the policies that we make. The council determines tax policy, and the public is able to see transparently and accountably how we do our work, the people's work. And that is not the manner in which this was proposed forward, to recalculate 30 years of precedent without a significant public debate and a transparent and thoughtful conversation with public input is deeply disturbing and very troubling to me as a lifelong Montgomery County resident. It is simply not the way that we do business here. It is not the manner in which we have handled our work in government, a place where most people believe in government. And this does not, I believe, help to add trust to the manner in which we do government. This was not put forward in a transparent way prior to public hearings about the budget, about the tax decisions that the county executive has made. And this is one further example of the very difficult circumstances with which this council has had to step up in this very challenging environment. The property tax increase is $65 million that we've had to find. Understandable that that is a public policy disagreement that we've had in a transparent way. We can have an honest disagreement about that, and I can respect that. But we've had to address that. This is about $5.2 million on top of that. The tax offset is $1.8 million in addition to that. Again, a policy decision that we can debate. And then there was the $10 million negative appropriation that we were told very clearly by our council attorney and by our council staff were not legally allowed to pass. So it was a budget that was not balanced when it was sent over, put us in a very difficult and challenging situation, which was exacerbated and continues to be even more of a challenge based on the public health and economic crisis that we find ourselves in. And I am hopeful that we can vote this down and move on with our work, and hope that the process with which this was put forward is never repeated again.
Thank you. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to start by trying to help frame this and understand this a little bit better. So, Mr. Smith, are you there? Yes, I see you there. When the budget was presented to the council, did the county executive or anyone on his staff explain that the budget included this new calculation?
I did not read anything published that this was included.
So then how did you and others help discover this calculation?
Council staff was in conversation with the executive staff about different elements in the budget, and then as the council saw during its Thursday review of the tax rates did increase after setting it at 692 and the charter limit, which typically does not happen when assessments increase, and that raised more questions, and that's where we went from there.
Okay. So it was through discussion with executive staff as the budget process has been moving forward.
Correct.
Okay. So let's turn it over to executive staff. I see Mr. Madaleno and Covio on with us. I don't know which of you would prefer to take the lead, but I'll ask the question, simple, straightforward question. Why did you decide to make this change?
You're on mute, Rich. Still on mute.
All right, there you go. I'm sorry, I forgot that I'm the one that has to unmute myself. The county executive discussed this in all of his public forums during the fall, that his belief that the charter, both the need for us to change the charter, because the existing charter provision about the revenue cap is debilitating for county government, for county services. And if you think this year is bad, next year with potentially negative inflation will be even worse, and it will make the public think we have a problem that we don't, because of the rules and not because of some underlying economic condition. The executive wanted to do this because he believes that by not counting that 40%, remember, to reiterate what Mr. Smith said, that 40% is not going to be, another bill isn't being sent out to those taxpayers. But by not counting that additional 40%, you are, in the following year, you are inadvertently setting the property tax rate too low because of the way the interplay between last year's revenues and next year's estimated tax base. So he believes that this is the correct way to have new construction pay totally for its enhancement to the overall tax base. We would have, obviously the council staff got the letter from the county attorney in early March. The GO committee had a scheduled briefing for this on April 29th before all council committees were canceled. The executive would have brought this up at the breakfast on March 16th. It was part of his remarks that got canceled because of the whole situation. So been an unusual year. Councilmember Reamer is correct that in the final iteration of the budget book, the piece that explained this was taken out for revision and did not make it back in before it went to the printer. For that, I am profoundly sorry, but other than that, there would have been deep conversation. And of course, many of you have heard the county executive say over and over that he thinks the charter interpretation is wrong and has been talking about that for months.
Sure. And so it's unfortunate that the deep conversation is being had the week the budget is to be approved. I think there's universal agreement on that statement. And I attended a number of the executives' budget forums, fondly remembering the days when we could gather and, talk about policies and civic life and all that stuff. But while he shares a lot of different opinions at those types of forums, to say something in a forum but then not convey it to the council or not to, as you noted, not to even include the cover page in the budget for whatever reason is a problem, as you've heard and will probably continue to hear from any of my colleagues that follow me. But I just want to pick up on the point that you said, just so I understand the policy correct, that the way we are currently calculating property taxes and assessing them, new construction is not fully adding its true value to the base of our property assessment. Is that correct?
That is the executive's interpretation.
Okay. With regard to the property assessment, because they're done quarterly, do you think that this is a point in time where we should revisit our arrangement with the State Department of Assessments and Taxation to possibly bring it back in-house so we can have more control over this process?
So assessments are done on a triennial basis, right? The billing for new construction is done quarterly. So that's why you wind up with a situation where someone gets a 75%, 50%, a quarter, or 25% bill for new construction. So I don't know if that, if we were to have control over the system of assessments, I don't know if we would be able to charge someone the property tax for the full year if they've only had the ability to occupy a facility or a home for 4 months. So even if you had that control, I don't know if you would change the way the billing happens in the first year. But I do think it makes sense that the entire value get added to the entire value of the bill get added to the revenue side, because the entire value of the property gets added to the valuation side.
Sure.
So since this is it's two variables that come up with the property limit, I think both sides of this equation should have new construction fully added. Right now, it's fully added to the one part of the calculation, the assessable base. It is not fully added to the revenue side. And that creates in itself a different sort, minuscule, because we're talking about small amounts, but still an inequity to every other taxpayer in the jurisdiction.
Right. Well, thank you for that. The reason I wanted to ask the questions is so that everybody who's paying attention to this conversation understand why you made these decisions and what it is exactly we're talking about. Mr. Cuvier, let me just turn it over to you real quick. During your confirmation hearing, I brought up this topic with SSTAT towards the end, and it was very brief. But now that this conversation has been forced upon us, let me just ask you quite simply, when we're doing assessments on homes, what is the assessed value, the property tax, what is the percentage of the assessed value that homeowners in Montgomery County are paying? And let me put it a different way. We have, homes that have been built for 50 years, 90 years, 100 years, and then homes that are brand new, quote unquote, new construction. With relation to each other, are they all paying the same rates in property taxes?
Well, no, they don't all pay the same rates because there are multiple tax classes around the county. Let me rephrase that. Same percentage of their assessed worth. Well, for a property that isn't new construction, they're all paying on 100% of their assessed value. Yes.
What was the first part of your statement?
For anything that's not new construction, which is 99+%.
Right. So, yes. What we're talking about here is new construction. That's this entire conversation. So, what percentage are they paying on their rates?
If we're only talking about new construction, we're talking about a very small part of the tax base, and they're paying on the portion of the assessed value that is in use during that 1 year where it is new construction. So if it's a $100,000 property and it was brought in the first quarter of the fiscal year, it would be taxed at 75% of that $100,000 or $75,000. If it was brought in the semi-annual, or not the semi-annual, but in the half-year billing or the half-year supplemental bill, then it would be brought in at 50% for that 1 year. And then if it was brought in the third quarter of the year, it would be brought in as 1 quarter, so 25%.
So you're saying that they catch up in the subsequent years so that there's parity 100%?
Well, eventually they'll pay on the full value of the full assessed value of the property, either the next year or the following year. Yes.
Okay. I knew that there's a lag, and I've seen some data that suggests that they're not fully caught up even after that second year or once those cycles complete themselves. But again, what I'll say, I'll conclude in this way. There's a lot to talk about here. I think this is a really important conversation because at its core, what we're talking about is having a fair and equitable process for evaluating our property values. That's it. And as was just noted, it's a fact that newer homes are not paying the same percentage as other homes throughout the county. And that's the reality. And so we should have another conversation about our policies. We need to have a conversation about any big policy change, which underscores the point that in the last week of the budget, having a conversation about this at this point in time is not the way to go about it. I wish the executive had come to us early on and said, within the confines of this FY21 budget, here's something I'd like to talk about. And it's an important conversation to talk about, just not in the last week of this budget when we're dealing with so many other issues, namely life and death in our community, trying to make sure everybody is healthy and safe. So with that, I'll be supporting the motion and look forward to a future conversation about creating fair and equitable taxing policies in Montgomery County. I yield back. Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Reamer.
Thanks. Well, I need to clear something up here because Mr. Magliano implied that by making this change, somehow developers would be paying their fair share. That is not what this is about at all. Developers will pay their assessed tax.
I didn't say anything about developers, and you're correct. This is not about developers because in the end, it is the property owner who pays the tax when the occupancy permit is built. So if you're building...
The property owner is going to pay their tax based on getting it assessed. This is about how large is next year's tax base that we are setting rates to. And when you include the full value of...
This is not about the tax base. This is about the revenue calculation for
Yeah, well, fine.
The tax base fully includes the new construction.
Let me finish.
If you can just have one person speak, please. Go ahead.
This is about the amount of revenue that we are using to estimate our target for next year's property tax rates. Correct. And when you include a full year's value of the construction, it means that that amount is larger. And so when we set the rates, we set higher rates for next year. So it's everybody else that pays more when this method is used. The tax increase falls across the entire population of taxpayers, everybody. Again, I want to say, I would, if this had been the way it was done because the charter allowed it 30 years ago, that would be fine. The charter does not allow us to do it this way. And the implication of not doing it this way is not that somehow one group of people is getting away with something or shifting the burden to another group of people. It doesn't have that consequence. It just means that all taxpayers pay a little bit less from year to year if revenue is kept at the charter limit. So including this is a way of allowing the county to collect a little bit more revenue. Again, what the distinction here is the county executive's proposal for the property tax increase for education was very public. He presented it, he argued for it, he's still arguing for it. Right or wrong, that's the way we're supposed to conduct our affairs. This one was just conducted, it's not written. It is also a $5 million tax increase on all payers, regardless of its rationale or justification. And it was not presented. And it is clearly in violation of the charter. So it is, not only was it lacking transparency, but it is illegal. So, but again, I just want to clear up because there's some confusion. This does not shift the burden from one group or another group. The executive is not helping one group of people at the expense of another group of people. It's simply raising the the amount that all payers will pay by a small but meaningful amount, $5 million this year, presumably a similar amount next year, and every year so on after, depending on the amount of construction.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you. I just wanted to expound on that very quickly, just to simplify things in terms and ask Mr. Smith, since you were the one, thankfully, who identified some of these issues and some of the discrepancies with the tax rate. What we were told before is 60% of new construction approximately is calculated as part of the revenues, with which the charter limit is determined as part of the predetermined formula. That means that 40% is not calculated as part of that base. That's what we're talking about here from a policy issue, whether that's right or wrong, whether that's how it could be or not. Who pays for the 40% if we were to charge 100% of that property? Who would bear the cost in terms of taxpayers?
All taxpayers on the rolls for fiscal. So in fiscal 20, let's say you collected 60% of the construction revenues on average. 40% gets added. Everybody that has a property and paying property taxes in 21 will pay that extra 40%.
So the additional value that we are currently not calculating as part of the revenue to determine the charter limit which dictates property taxes in the county, would be borne by taxpayers, not by the individual property owners of the individual properties. So the $5.17 million here and any subsequent amount related to that same amount would be borne by all taxpayers, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, I think that's an important clarification for everybody to be able to make. I just have one follow-up question for Mr. Madaleno. You mentioned a document sent over to the council in March discussing this particular change, and I just wanted to see if you wanted to expound further on that.
It was advice that was provided to the county executive by the county attorney that was shared with Mr. Drummer and Mr. Smith.
Those are all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you. I share the concern of my colleagues regarding process, and while it is undeniably true that the county executive did articulate this concern and his interest in doing something like this through the budget planning sessions that they had in so many different communities, we didn't find out about it until fairly recently, as has been noted. And so I am going to support the amendment because I do think that this is a discussion that we need to have. But there are a number of key policy elements here that are yet to be answered, and we need to have a deliberative conversation about those policy angles before I would feel comfortable moving something like this forward. So I appreciate the effort to be creative. I respect that, but at the same notion, have concerns with the process, and we'll be supporting the amendment, and so that we can have this discussion at a later time.
Thank you. Councilmember Rice.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to say the same thing that Councilmember Albornoz did. I think that, again, it's process. It's about notification, making sure that people are aware. And so from that perspective, again, I'll be supporting the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, as will I. Councilmember Raymer.
Thanks. Well, I'd like to follow up on the mention that was made of the memo, the legal advice on this issue. I'd like to ask Bob Drummer, the council attorney, for his view on the risk as far as the legal standing of this proposal.
Good afternoon. When you give a legal opinion, you're basically making a prediction of what the courts will do. It's helpful to have what prior courts have done in the same situation. We don't have that here. You're looking at language and interpreting it. The language you're looking at says this limit, being the charter limit, does not apply to revenue from newly constructed property. The first thing a court would look at would be, well, what's the plain meaning of that? My thought was the plain meaning is actual revenue received. But if you argue that maybe it means, revenue that you will receive, over the full year, and then you could argue it's ambiguous, the court would then look at, well, what other information do we have? And you have two things that I think are important. One is, and not necessarily in this order, but one is that the people, the county that has been living with this charter for 30 years has interpreted it to mean actual revenue for 30 years. That must mean something, that's the way it was looked at. And then secondly, and I wasn't working for the county 30 years ago, but when the charter amendment came in, the purpose of this amendment was to restrict the property tax rate that the county could raise, could levy and keep it down. So looking at it from that viewpoint, you'd have to say, well, if the people that wrote this were trying to hold down tax rates, they would probably have meant actual revenue and not potential revenue. So, my opinion is it's not free from doubt, but I think, the courts would probably rule that that the way the county's been doing it
Sorry, can you say that again? I lost you, that last sentence you just said.
the penultimate
sentence. Fighting his fiber net, trying to prevent discussion.
My opinion is that the courts, if asked, the Court of Appeals, if asked, would ultimately rule, for all the reasons I explained, that this provision means actual revenue received during the relevant year for newly constructed property, and not the potential revenue you could have received had everything been online for a full year.
Right. And this is not the first time this issue has come up over the years. There's been many attempts by administrations to consider whether this shift could be made. I think everyone looks at this and says the plain language of the charter is unavoidable, inescapable, much as we might wish it to be otherwise. This is what it is. It doesn't mean it's rational, doesn't mean it's what we would want it to be, but it is what it is. That's been the posture of the county government for 30 years. And that's why it has never changed. So, you've expressed your concern about how strong this position would be, and the inverse of that is it's very subject to legal challenge. So, if the council were to approve it, we could easily end up court. Frankly, the best thing we could hope for would be to go to court immediately and to have this issue resolved, because otherwise, that $5 million keeps adding up every year. And then 5 years from now, we owe $25–30 million. And then we lose a case and we got to send out refund checks to that same amount, which is, by the way, impossible for people 5 years ago who might have left. What a mess. What a mess. And for the county executive to just include this without a plan, without any real engagement, without knowing how this would all play out, is just very disappointing.
Okay. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to add that I have, incredible respect for the finance department. I have, over the years, gotten to see them, front seat row as we prepare for our meetings with the rating agencies and how thorough they all are. I was surprised when I first heard the executive make a comment about this particular issue, because again, I have extraordinary respect for the group of professionals in the finance department who have been calculating this particular item in a particular way, including those who preceded them. So I think it's important to note that. I also want to point out that, we all last year, I think all of us had conversations about particular fiscal policies that we wanted to examine and we wanted to be very deliberate about, because these are very important and structural changes. And of course, we all know that the pandemic hit and a lot of things were appended, but it doesn't mean that we should somehow shortcut these deliberations and somehow move ahead with incorporating such tremendous policy changes into a budget. And so to me, that was also part of my discomfort, is the fact that there are a number of fiscal policy changes baked into this budget that we have not had an opportunity to fully vet. And so, again, I think that for all of those reasons, I made the motion, and glad to hear that I think my colleagues agree. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no other speakers on the list. Does anybody else want to speak before we vote? We have a motion by Councilmember Navarro, seconded by Councilmember Friedson. All those in favor, please raise your hand. That carries unanimously. Thank you very much. I have nothing else on the agenda, though I did want to, Mr. Howard, are you on the call? Greg? Yeah, I see you are.
Yes, sir.
Can you update us on when we will take up the community grants?
Yes. So the current plan is, after some discussions today, is to take that up on Wednesday. Will be the best day to make sure we have all the information that council members need for that issue.
Okay. Does everybody hear that? At this moment, we're taking it up on Wednesday. Head shaking. Yes. At this moment, we're taking it up on Wednesday. Okay. And with that, thank you all very much for being with us. We are adjourned. Thanks.